So if this were an Oxford-style debate, I would be arguing the affirmative, that the strongest arguments, both scriptural arguments and secular arguments, are arguments against the reign of rulers and the coercion of kings, and how that these institutions are quite often, if not exclusively. However, this is not an Oxford-style debate, so I'll reintroduce myself. Hi, I'm Ken. I grew up Baptist. I grew up super Baptist, in a super Baptist family and a super Baptist church. When I was 9 years old, I said the trademark sinner's prayer because I read one of those tracts that are like Jack Chick tracts, yep. Right? That show the hordes of well, this had color, so it wasn't Jack Chick, but they had hordes of unrepentant wicked thrown into a lake of fire. There was a beast with 7 heads. God was sitting there on his throne, like looking very unhappy with these people, and I was 9 years old. I didn't want to be on their team, so I got saved for fire insurance, right? Then in my Super Baptist church, I went on to learn about like inerrancy from people who had never picked up like a reverse interlinear like Hebrew Greek Bible. I learned about like evolution from people that had never read Darwin. I learned about Catholicism from people that never really set foot inside of a Catholic church, never attended Mass, maybe knew a coworker that was Catholic. I grew up homeschooled, so politically I grew up very conservative. We listened to like Rush Limbaugh and like Glenn Beck on the radio.
Glenn Beck.
Oh yeah. Oh, we watched with the chalkboard and everything. It was a fun time growing up. I learned about U.S. history from Christian homeschool textbooks they leaned heavily on like manifest destiny and like divine providence. Basically, America was given to the settlers by God. This is their land. That's kind of how I grew up. After 9/11, I learned about Islam from people that had never met a Muslim, and about economics from people that didn't really know the difference between the Chicago school or the Austrian school or Keynesian school of economics. And then I grew up. I met other Christians. I moved away from my hometown, and I met Christians that drank. Did you guys know we could do that? Did you guys know that the first miracle wasn't turning water into grape juice? I thought it was. My whole growing up, I thought Jesus turned water into grape juice. And then I met other Christians that believed different things than me. I learned about like John Nelson Darby and the rapture, which is a much, much newer doctrine than people think. And then on the politics side, I started reading Marx. And also like Murray Rothbard, right? The two like far extremes of the political spectrum. I started reading Noam Chomsky and like Ron Paul. You guys, his like farewell address to Congress, it's really good. I wore the libertarian hat for a couple of years. But what brought me to where I am today is learning, like what really introduced me to the concepts of anarchy was the American abolitionist movement. And y'all have no clue how many anarchists were in the like anti-slavery movement. There was this guy, Lysander Spooner, who, and William Lloyd Garrison, who were arguing for secession like 10 years before the Civil War. They were arguing that like the Christian and the moral American has no union with slaveholders, and that like the people that were anti-slavery should secede from the Union, right? You don't hear about that I never heard about that in textbooks. At the same time, there was this guy across the Atlantic Ocean who was their contemporary and their correspondent named Leo Tolstoy, who you may have heard of, wrote War and Peace and The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You, and wrote a ton of pamphlets on politics and anarchy. And he wrote about like Christians' responsibility to God, the rejection of the state, and the utter corruption of institutions and rulers. And here I am today, embracing Christian anarchy. My main appeal to you guys is that Christianity is closest to Christ when the sword is pointed at us, and that we are furthest from Christ when we are holding the sword pointing at somebody else. Don't worship the red calf and don't worship the blue calf, right? Don't make an idol out of anything. Don't reject the idols, especially the idols that like offer to make the world in your image. right? Yeah, Christian part over. The next part is like pathos and logos, kind of like, appeals to reason and kind of emotion. The secular arguments, like not found in scripture, are basically democracy is 3 wolves and 1 sheep arguing what's for dinner, right? And they're going to vote about it. So I'm sorry, we voted. But for real, like, why does the entire country have to do the same thing? Like, I like federalism. Whoever said nation of states, like that's cool. Like sanctuary cities are cool. I like those for weed or immigration. I like the idea that like New York City and North Dakota, they shouldn't have the same gun laws. But like with the way like the Supreme Court and Congress is going now, it's going to be like everybody in America has to follow the same rules, right? Consolidating this much federal power is only going to snowball into basically your local community has to follow the same rules as the local community in California and Florida and New York. Some of those laws are funnier. Like, we still have laws in the books that say it's illegal to sell onion rings made up out of chopped onions, and then you fry them. Like, that's illegal. And everyone in America has to follow those rules. Now, they're probably not going to get arrested for it, but the heavier stuff is like war, though. Like, we're all at war right now. America is at war, right? Which is why I said earlier, like, America, the institution, is not the same as Americans, right? Like, what do a bunch of salamanders in Washington, D.C. have to say about, like, what you or I think about, the people in Libya or the people in, like, Syria? And why are we at war with, like we left Afghanistan, 6 different countries right now? They never did anything to me. Why can't I make somebody my business partner that immigrated here from Mexico and didn't sign the right papers when they crossed the line? What business of the state is it for me to have an economic interaction with somebody that I want to have an interaction with? IP and patent laws are kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, the government just grants monopolies to like people like Monsanto, and if their crops blow into the field next to them, and the field next to them accidentally starts growing Monsanto branded genetic crops, like, they have to pay the Monsanto. It's crazy. It's crazy. And I like the organizations that happen free from government control, like Wikipedia or open source software is community oriented, anti patent and intellectual property laws. And it's just a bunch of people building on what the previous person built without hiding it behind a locked door and saying, if anybody wants this, they have to pay me first. That's kind of crazy. And we just all kind of accept it as normal. Largely, economically, I'm kind of a agnostic anarchist. I think the black flag comes in many colors: anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-capitalism. They all have their pros and cons. The biggest umbrella is just the term anarchy, anarchos, without rulers. And as long as you're not using big countries or big churches or big cities to coerce and control people, especially by force, you're cool with me. Anarchy is not utopianism. You can't point where has anarchy been tried? No, it's a destination. It's a series of decisions. Sorry, it's not a destination. It's a direction. It's a series of decisions that either take you towards large control by companies and corporations and governments, or takes you away from that control. Like Leo Tolstoy, I am convinced that the problems and the violence caused by the state are much bigger and much more terrible problems than the problems and violence that would originate if the state were to remove its hand. There's a famous American anarchist from the 1950s named Amon Hennessy. He says, a Christian does not depend upon bullets or ballots to accomplish the work of God. And I think so too. I think the best things that we do in the church, the best things that are done by the church, happen outside of government, without any interaction from the government. And I think that's kind of where Christ called us to. I am about to run out of time, but in summary, my allegiance is not to a flag. It's not to some dirt or a book or a church. It is an allegiance to the revolutionary paradox of a nonviolent, enemy-loving servant king who became a conqueror not by the sword, not by dealing out death to his enemies, but instead by conquering death itself. His law is love. And his judgment is mercy. There is no king but Christ.
Amen. Hey, I'm going to do something kind of weird as a moderator. I'm going to ask you real quick before Calvin comes up to just define sort of in practical terms, when you say Christian anarchy, what is that or what isn't it? Did you understand the question? Sure. Just because I know Calvin's going to, and I want people to hear like, oh, that's different in this way.
Like I would say nonviolent, non-resistant opposition to the state. That's probably what Christian anarchy is. But again, it's like anarchy is anarchist without rulers. And the black flag comes in many colors. I'm cool with any like economic system, any community organized system, just as long as you're not using like coercion and like control. Yeah. So lots of different definitions.
All right, now you can applaud. Yay. All right, Calvin, join us.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Standing in a good place. All right. Hi. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to introduce myself again. My name is Calvin Maynard. I go to Holy Trinity Reformed Episcopal Church. I'm a graduate of Houston Baptist, now Christian University. I don't know. I don't like the name change. I graduated in political science. I got my JD from South Texas College of Law. I'm an attorney. I specialize in criminal defense mostly. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basic first principles of where I'm going to be coming from, because I think any discussion where we don't start off with the foundational beliefs we're all coming from, we're just going to talk past each other the entire time, and that's a waste of everybody's time. So I'd like to begin by just discussing what I believe to be the nature of man. I think that when we're discussing governments and society, the only way that we're going to have a productive discussion is if we agree on or recognize where we disagree on what kind of a thing people are. I believe that man is the highest creature of God's creation. We were made in his image with moral capacities, with the ability to use reason, and that image of God is what separates us from the animals. But that being said, we're not a perfect creature. We are a fallen creature who is subject to a sin nature that is unavoidable. As Romans 3 tells us, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away, right? We are all subject to this nature that goes against what God is and what God wants for us. That being said, how that manifests itself, I would point then to Romans 8:7, where it goes even further. The mind governed by flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of flesh cannot please God. Not only are we fallen, we are incapable of helping ourselves. What we needed was the free grace and the mercy given by God when he sent his son to die for us. So unless we agree on what kind of creature man is, a rational, moral one who has fallen and who falls victim to sin, to passions, to selfishness, greed, envy, etc., we're never going to agree on what kind of systems we need to organize how this animal we call man lives on earth. Now that I've talked about what kind of a thing I believe people are, I think we need to discuss what government is and why we need some kind of organizing principle. For me, what was most formative in the way I think about this subject is Aristotle's Politics. I think he put it very well when he said that man is the best of animals when perfected, which is a loose translation. He doesn't mean perfected, meaning we are perfect, but rather so he is the worst of all when sundered from law and justice. Unrighteousness is most pernicious when possessed of weapons, and man is born possessing weapons, for the use of wisdom and virtue. In short, because we are fallen, but we have this capacity for reason, we can be very, very dangerous to each other. Mm-hmm. People will act selfishly and badly, and they will hurt each other, and they will do really terrible things to one another in their own interests unless there is some kind of a central organizing force, some kind of external controls are placed on their behavior. People need to be told, don't kill each other, don't steal from each other. People need some kind of organizational direction for us to bring our collective efforts together and create this thing that we call civilization, society. Man, without some kind of law and government, is prone to doing some really, really awful stuff. So let's talk about a few definitions. What are governments, and what are some of the other words that I'm going to be using and we'll be discussing, and what do I mean by them? Now, when I say government, which is kind of the most central theme, you can insert that to mean any form, any body with political power. A government can be a democracy, it can be a dictatorship, it can be an aristocracy, it can be a kingdom, any kind of system where people have some kind of rules saying, you can't do this thing, any kind of consequences for those negative actions, and any kind of central direction to organize human efforts into creating something collectively is a government. Even the most libertarian government that has ever existed, which I would argue is the judges of the Old Testament. The only government that God specifically set up for the Israelites when they became a nation was the law of God and one judge, literally just one guy whose job it was to judge individual cases. But when this one guy said, you're not following God's law, people had to listen to that. When an enemy invaded and the nation needed some kind of a leader to lead their armies and to save God's people from being conquered by devil-worshipping barbarians, there was a judge there. That is the least government you can possibly have. One guy. But
or girl.
It is a government. That's true. It can be a girl too. So when I say theonomy, a lot of people think of that as being more synonymous with theocracy than I think is strictly necessary. So let's separate out a few of those terms. I am a theonomist in the sense of the original Greek meaning, law of God. I believe that the most supreme law is the law that God gives to us, and that there are three primary spheres of influence, three different types of government, all of which need to be equally submitted to the law of God. You have the human secular government. This is your king, this is your democratic body, this is your parliament, your aristocrats, whatever form of government you have, that is a government, and it must be subject to the law of God. Some call it the law of nature, but ultimately that comes down to the same thing. There is the church, that is the ecclesiastical structure, your priests, your bishops, your lay ministers, etc. And the church needs to be submitted to the law of God. And you have your family, that needs to be submitted to the law of God as well. I would say theonomy, rightly understood, is not the church being in charge of the government. It is God being in charge of the government. It is God being in charge of the church. And it is God being in charge of the family. Each of the three spheres acknowledging Christ as its head and operating according to God's principles that he reveals to us in Scripture. I would distinguish that from ecclesiocracy, which I think is a more accurate word for what people would typically term theocracy. That's where the church rules the government. That's not what I'm advocating. That's not what I'm here to say. Instead, theonomy, God rules the government, God rules the church, God rules the family. Anarchy is one of those words that a lot of people seem to mean a lot of different things by, but I think that the only real definition of anarchy is one that comes from the root of the word, meaning there is no ruler. I believe that there have been instances of anarchy in history, which Scripture describes as every man did what was right in his own eyes. And if you look at the course of the Old Testament, it never ends well. Every man doing what is right in his own eyes has never resulted in more human flourishing, more liberty, more health for society. Instead, it results in periods of degeneracy and chaos, which eventually turn into ungodly tyranny, which demonstrates the simple fact that the neutrality of government, the neutrality of laws, the ability to say these things are going to organize us and God will not have any part, is a myth. There is no question as to whether we will be ruled, but how we will be ruled. And there are only two potential rulers that mankind may subject himself to God or to the enemy. And to say that I will not be subject to the law of God is to put yourself in the camp of the enemy. To say that the government will not follow the law of God, while often coming from a place of desiring more freedom, more liberty, and often rightly diagnosing tyrannical abuses, never ends in a place of more happiness, more freedom, and flourishing. Instead, any government which does not submit itself to God, His law, and His word will come more and more under the influence of the enemy. I believe that's something we've seen many times in history. Sadly, I believe it to be something that we are seeing around us, escalating and accelerating very quickly today. Having defined all of these terms, I'd like to give a brief discussion on governments in general. We can talk a little bit more about these from Scripture as we get into our Q&A and once we talk back and forth a little bit. But in brief, I believe that governments are fundamentally necessary and good. We'll be discussing in greater length Romans 13, which I believe is very clear that mankind has a need for government, that God has given them for a reason because He correctly understands what kind of creature we are and what happens if we are not organized and protected from each other. I believe that mankind has a duty to obey government. I believe that 1 Peter 2 is very clear about that, and that the duty to render unto Caesar is strong and it is clear, but it is not unlimited. I want to offer the caveat that I am not a governmental bootlicker and you have to do anything any government says. Ultimately, the law of God is always going to be highest, and any government which tells you not to follow the law of God or prohibits you from doing so has placed itself outside of God's blessing. Your duty then becomes to figure out, where is this government doing something good? Where is the government still a terror to the wicked? Just because you live under Nero doesn't mean that you're now allowed to murder, right? But it is then your job to figure out which of these government's laws must I, as a Christian, in all good faith, disobey, and how do I ethically go about that, knowing that God's law must and always will be the highest, whatever systems may exist presently here on earth. Thank you.
Oh man, so good, both of you. And I could almost feel, Ken wasn't saying a word, but I could almost feel like, I actually agree with that. Ooh, I don't know. Anyway, it was fun. Here's what I want to propose. Let's take a 4 or 5 minute break just to maybe throw some stuff away, get another drink, go to the bathroom if you want, and then I'm going to have these guys duke it out a little bit before we ask our questions. Sound good?
All right, so you mentioned an Aristotle quote about man, and man is the most, the best of the animals, that the weapons that we wield are wielded with wisdom and wielded with virtue. But those weapons are not always in the hands of God-fearing. I mean Aristotle, right? He would even admit probably that those weapons are not always used by the best of men. While this does separate us from animals, these weapons are quite dangerous. I think of Oppenheimer's, quote when he's like, what the heck have we done? We have just we have become death. on the world once we like unleash these weapons. So the use of those weapons by varying different types of governments. Can you jump into that?
Yes. So I think that the weapons in question that Aristotle talks about are reason. It's reason that makes us different from the animals, and it's what makes us dangerous. The fact that mankind has this ability to think and to reason and plan, as well as having this moral capacity, makes us different from animals, and it makes us very, very dangerous to each other. It's the fact that we can think is the biggest reason why we need something to control our actions and to say, hey, don't kill people and don't take their stuff, because otherwise we will, and it gets very nasty very quickly.
I mean, governments kill people and take their stuff all the time. With weapons, too. Like actual weapons, not weapons of reason and logic, you know?
Yes, absolutely. You're certainly not going to hear me say that governments are perfect, or that every government in history has always, done the right thing. It's the ones that have divorced themselves from God and that are not wielding the sword of justice against the wicked and in protection of the righteous that have done these most horrific evils. Government is a great responsibility. It's certainly something that can be and has been broadly misused, but it is fundamentally necessary and something that we need as a species.
So when the government uses that weapon, though, they're not always the Christians. And it is, I think that if you look at the most egregious uses of these weapons, they come from government, right? School shootings are back in the news again. And when we think about mass shootings, we tend to think that the largest mass shooting was probably, usually people think of Columbine, but Vegas, the Vegas shooting actually killed a lot more people. But neither one of those are the largest mass shootings. The largest one was Wounded Knee, right? Where a bunch of Native Americans were disarmed and then all shot. And it was a bunch of people unarmed shot in one place. That is usually how we define. But the state did it, so it's not technically a mass shooting, right? So these weapons wielded by people are very dangerous because we have reason, we have intellect. But wielded by people at the heads of state, right? You're just pulling that pendulum way, way further up, and then, you better hope that there is somebody moral holding it. Because if somebody immoral is holding it, they might let go and it swings all the way to the other side. Whereas the variability, human to human, is kind of just right down here.
Here's where I think we're talking past each other a little bit. Governments have always done, and will always do bad things. The answer to government abuses is not no government. The answer is better government. To say governments have done bad things, therefore we should get rid of them entirely, is a non sequitur that I just don't see the logical train following.
I'm going to ask you guys quickly to move off of this and onto something
else. Sure. The sequitur that I think is that, yes, theft, taxes, it's the libertarian joke, is that the government, the one that, oh man, I lost my train of thought. No, you're good. What was the last thing you just said? Yeah, go for it. My bad.
Oh, let me look at my notes here. I think that I would like to understand a little bit better. You say that anarchism or anarchy is a direction, not a destination. I'm fully aware that both of our sort of ideals on either side of the spectrum are pretty unlikely, right? I mean, we both know that we're not going to see our ideal societies, but it's a fun thought experiment anyway. Mm-hmm. Can you paint me a picture? What do things look like if you get your way? What do you think is at the end of this direction?
Like I said before, I think the black flag comes in many colors. Like the flag of, okay. So it's there's different flavors of anarchy, right? There's anarcho-communists who have a black and red flag, right? With the anarchy logo. There's the anarcho-capitalists who are super autistic about property rights. And they have a black and yellow flag, right? You've got anarcho-syndicalists who think like maybe we have socialism but with some kind of a market. And I would use the palette of all these different colors to paint a bunch of different anarchic societies. But I'll mention one that currently exists now, the Amish, right? They try their best to not render unto Caesar, right? And we can get into render unto Caesar because I really want to jump into the taxes thing. But, I mean, they have a community where they are governed by principles. It's a viable option where they can be governed by principles of God and not, like, institutions of man. You can argue, well, it's because the government lets them. So, yeah, Amish is one example. We don't have very many because usually when an anarchist movement gets so big, the state comes in and crushes it. But, yeah.
I would argue, let's imagine a world where the Amish get to more or less live, let's say the U.S. government didn't exist and the Amish more or less lived in their own communities, i.e., North America, early 1600s, right? I mean, they kind of had a time and they had rules governing their community. You couldn't steal, you couldn't kill people, you couldn't do this or that. And if you violated those rules, town councils, elders, etc., would subject you to some kind of a punishment. You weren't just allowed to do whatever you wanted. Just as in the modern Amish communities, you're not allowed to just do whatever you want. I would argue the Amish have a very minimal government, one which is pretty nicely submitted to God's law sufficiently that I'd say if it works for them, A-okay. But the fact that there are rules means that by definition, they're not living in anarchy.
It's voluntary, though. That's kind of like the biggest difference, is that like it's a voluntary community. And having a broad palette of a lot of different anarchic communities, I want to see what some of them look like. If you want to live in like a worker-owned like co-op building where like, you all work in a factory and you own the means of production, like collectively, like an anarcho-socialist thing, go for it. If you want to like live in an anarcho-capitalist like company town, go for it. But like the idea that like you have the same rules across the entire nation, come down from above, right, is like to call that government and to also call this voluntary community that does have rules that people agree to. Like, you're familiar with Rumspringa? The Amish concept that like, okay, so Rumspringa is when you turn like either 14. I was going to say either like 16 or 18, but it might be younger. You can leave the Amish community with a free ticket to do whatever you want to and come back. And a ton of them do. Because they go out, they drink, they fornicate, sometimes not, but they go out, they take their Rumspringa, and they see, like, they have their own personal Ecclesiastes, right? Where it's like, oh, this is vanity of vanities and dust, and like, it's a vapor, I'm chasing nothing, I'm going to go back to a structured community, and it's voluntary.
I guess I have one more question
Sure.
before she moves us on. In this hypothetical future where the central government has collapsed and people live in their own chosen anarcho-syndicalist, whatever that means, communities, and someone kills somebody, what happens to the murderer?
What happens to the murderer in America, right? A lot of the objections to anarchy are descriptions of the status quo.
I'm not objecting, I'm asking you.
No.
What happens?
I would say a lot of different things. The same as happens now. We don't have a national death penalty, right? We have different, like when somebody kills somebody right now in cold blood, and some states would give that the death penalty. Some would give them life in prison, right? I would imagine a lot of different things would happen in a lot of different communities.
Should someone stop people from killing each other?
I think the people would probably be the best. And if you want
then it sounds like that's a government by the people, but that's a government.
Okay, but the government that we have right now is not by the people.
I'm not defending the government we have right now. I'm defending the concept of government in its entirety.
Which cycles us back to the point that we were making earlier, which is that, like, yes, there is this ideal version of government that could wield the sword for God, which is kind of, antithetical to what Jesus teaches, but just go with me for a moment. It could wield the sword for God, but the second they're voted out of power, right, like it's that pendulum I mentioned, where like the Republicans give their president so much executive power, and then it swings to the Democrats. And it's like, oh no, all these executive orders are now repealed and a bunch of new ones are issued. And then, so what they do is this isn't a pendulum, it's a wrecking ball between two castles, right? And with every time it slams into one, they stack more weight on it, right? Because it'll smash into the other one. And that smashes into the other one. So like, even if there was a good one that could be wielded by God, what happens when that, that ruler dies, or that, you mentioned the every man did what was right in his own image. What happened after? Samuel. What happened? Was it Judges or Samuel?
Oh, it happened a lot of times.
Right. Sorry, in his own image. I meant in his own. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Yeah. In Samuel, right after it's mentioned, Israel asks for a king. And God says, no, that's a bad idea. You do not want a king. Through the prophet Samuel, he says, the king will take your daughters and make them his servants. He'll take your sons and make them his war slaves. He will take a fraction of your cattle and your grain. He said, you don't want a king. And they say, well, give us a king anyways. King Saul happens. Right? That was bad. King David happens. That's mixed. But then we got Jehoiakim and Ahab, and even right after David, we have Solomon, who's bringing all of these idolatries from foreign military alliances that he's made into the kingdom of Israel. Right? Even stuff that is given to us by God, saying you really don't want this, but have at it. That's it didn't really work for Israel either. But you mentioned judges, not the kings, so it's.
I think that at this point, and if I understand you correctly, I think that we're somewhere along the same spectrum.
Okay.
Both of us will agree that governments do bad things all of the time, and I'm not here to defend those. And I think that we've come to a point where we'll both agree people shouldn't kill each other, they should be stopped from killing each other, and that if someone does kill somebody else, they ought to face some kind of a consequence. Literally any form of organization that crafts those rules and enforces them is a government. Even what happened right before the kings, when God brought the Israelites into the land, he said, here are my laws, the laws of the Old Testament. I want you to follow these, and here is a judge whose job it is going to be to make decisions about those laws. God gave them a government, a very small, minimalistic one which was submitted to his will, and one that he was cautioning them not to replace with a king. But they had one. Even in these anarcho-syndicalist, whatever communities you describe, you said a few minutes ago, people shouldn't kill each other. They should be stopped from killing each other and will face some form of consequence for killing each other. That's not anarchism. That is a government. It's a small one. It may look like a form that is hardly recognizable compared to what we've seen before, but that's a government. And that's what God has prescribed, and that's what God has called for us to be submitted to.
What's the quote? Ipsos custodi et custodi, who watches the watchman? Right? When you say, oh, people need consequences for killing other people, but I mentioned Wounded Knee. You can think of cops with qualified immunity. How often are governments held accountable? Right? The government is allowed to drone strike a wedding in Pakistan, and nobody is going to be held accountable when that sword. So we are.
Everybody will be held accountable.
Okay.
God has promised that.
I would agree. We both agree. But by no king but Christ, heavenly judgment, not earthly judgment, because I think we agree in that we're talking past each other, but I kind of want to come back and connect, because when you talk about the idea that the government is keeping people from killing each other, and I would respond oh, well, what happens when the government kills each other, right? I think we're both trying to solve the theophany, the problem of evil, right? We both agree that it would be best. Again, I'm a Christian anarchist. I'm not the no gods, no masters, original Russian anarchists, right? I am a Christian anarchist, and we both agree that the dictates of God should be followed. But when you give that power to a human, when you give that power to a government, they're not always going to, we have what was written in the book of Judges, but like, what happens when one of those judges goes bad? You know?
I believe when you say when we give that power to a human, you imply that there is the possibility of giving that power to nobody. That possibility does not exist. There is no such thing. There never has been, and there never will be such a thing as nobody wielding that power. There's only the question of who. And given that dilemma in a fallen, finite, pre-completed redemption world, I would rather the godly be given that power than the ungodly. I would rather the law of God rule us than the law of the enemy rule us. It is fundamentally a binary choice.
I want to step in real quick because I asked Ken a question at the end of his, and I want to ask you a question now, Calvin.
Sure.
You haven't really give us a practical, for those of us that are like, woo, this is all over our heads. Give us a practical, what would it look like for theonomy to actually work, say, here in America? What would that look like practically? And then you guys can spar some more.
Well, that's a really difficult question because we, as a society, have so much history and so much that it makes it difficult to say any one form of government would be right for one group of people at one time. I think that what I would come down to, first of all, is Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica says, if a king were to implement the law of God in his own country, he would not sin in doing so. Whether that looks like a kingdom, an aristocracy, a democracy, the rule of judges, depends entirely, I think, on the will of a people, what the people want, the character and history of the nation, 100,000 other things. Broadly speaking, I would like to see America probably broken up into significantly smaller portions than it is now. Whether that look like states, smaller, more distributivist communities. There are lots of different ways that could look like, but fundamentally any form of government that said God's law is going to be the highest. And to sort of head off an idea of what that looks like, I want to make very clear, some people believe that we ought to just take the Old Testament law that God gives in, the Old Testament and map that over onto America exactly as it stood now. I don't believe that. The Old Testament law was given to a particular people in a particular time and place for a particular purpose that broadly doesn't really apply to us right now and has been fulfilled in Christ. That being said, I would like to see a government that looks at the Old Testament and mines it for normative truths about what God considers to be good and desirable and acceptable from our laws. So all that is broadly to say, what exactly does that look like? I don't know. I can't say. That's something that it's really kind of impossible for any sociologist or historian, let alone little old me, to say. But I would say any form of government that puts the law of God and honoring Him as its highest government, its highest good, would be better than one that does not.
Oh, okay, no, that's great. And like, I kind of agree with that. It's like, oh, what is it going to look like? I don't know. Like, I don't know what mine looks like either. I have some ideas and I would like them all to be tried, right? And what he was talking about is like these core principles that were in the Old Testament and probably a lot of them in the New Testament, right? He would like to try those. But I mean, if anarchy is a direction, like you're going less federal, more like state and local, like I'll go with you that far.
Absolutely.
And you can hop off the train when you get there.
1%
I'm going to keep going. Right.
Okay, here's something. If you want to picture, if you want to know sort of the ideal society I want to live in, if I could snap my fingers and have my way, any Lord of the Rings fans here?
Oh,
I want to live in the Shire. That's where I want to be. I want to be a hobbit. I want to live in the shower.
I was going to say, what is the whole point? The Ring of Power is too much for anyone to handle. It will necessarily corrupt you. I know he hated allegory, and it wasn't exactly an allegory for political power. I'm going to use it for one. This ring of power is too much for any one being to handle. It must be thrown into the flames. I mean, it's yeah.
Well, okay, if I may then...
Sorry, I'm a Tolkien guy. I love it.
If I expand on this picture of the Shire, that would be what one of my favorite writers ever, G.K. Chesterton, he called it distributivism, where basically we're looking at small communities, private property on a pretty small scale, pretty minimal governments, but you've got a little something. You've got a few rules. And a lot of incorporation with nature, closeness to the land and your community. If I could snap my fingers and have my way, that would be where I would like to be. It's not a whole lot of government, but it's a little bit of something that I think we still need, because otherwise it's a much, much nastier sort of place.
If he snapped his fingers, I'd be happy with that too. I probably wouldn't be complaining as much.
Okay, but that's a good spot to stop, y'all. I know you could talk about so many other things. I have so many questions about everything. So I'm going to let you guys ask first, and then I'll decide what mine is. So we each get to ask a question. If you raise your hand, I'll come to you with the mic. So I have the one with the long cord. You're going to have this one again and just eat the heck out of it. Be a gangster. But I do have one question that someone submitted who doesn't want to ask it him or herself because they might indict themselves if someone recognizes them on the podcast. So here's the question. And later, if you want, I can connect you guys to talk more. But he asked, or she, okay. How does your position address or oppose the current trend in elementary schools that promotes gender equity and equality in education? Do you want me to ask it again?
Can I hear it one more time?
Yeah. How does your position address or oppose the current trend in elementary schools that promotes gender equity and equality in education?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what that means. I'll say, broadly speaking, I think that God loves boys and girls equally, and I think that men and women should be treated equally. Whether that means entirely the same at all points is a different question, but I guess
you haven't been watching the
really...
news much about what's happening in education, yeah?
I would say that
I don't watch a lot of news.
Okay.
I would say that these are government schools. The biggest problem is that people are being stolen their property taxes, and even if you rent, your landlord just doesn't eat the property taxes out of the goodness of his heart. No, he's passing that on to you, right? Your property taxes are going to pay for these government-run schools that are doing this, right? Honestly, if we had vouchers or whatever and parents were allowed to decide where their kids go, I'm sure a lot of people in the Christian church would have a problem with gender affirming, but they're not your kids anymore, right? And you're not paying for that. So, this...
Hey guys, Sarah here. Sorry to interrupt the podcast. I know it was awesome, but I just wanted to tell you that Theology on Tap is growing. We are now a standalone ministry, an independent nonprofit, and to grow, we need your help. We're offering more live events, more follow-up opportunities to reach the unchurched, and increased partnerships with local churches. You can help us grow by praying for us, by telling your friends or church about us, and of course, partnering with us financially. To donate, go to HoustonTOT.com/give. Okay, enjoy the rest of the show.
Comes from government schools.
I definitely agree with you on that. Yeah. I'm huge on school choice and school vouchers. I was the beneficiary. My parents had to make some pretty significant sacrifices to send me and my sisters to a Christian private school, and I thank God for that every single day. I certainly like the idea of children being educated to respect God and His law, not whatever the fashion of the day in government is. I guess if the question is about gender equality, then I guess I would say, yeah, boys and girls should be treated equally. If the question is about
gender-affirming care,
then that's a very different question. In which case, how spicy do we want to be? I guess I will say God created man and woman, and anything that says otherwise is a lie from the enemy, and that it goes to a very nasty place very quickly.
But what do we do about that lie? Do we wield the sword?
Yes.
Okay.
I would much rather that we teach children God's law instead of the enemy's.
All right.
Children will always be educated in some fashion, whether it's in schools or on the streets, and we have a decision. Do we bring a child up in the way that he should go, or do we let the enemy do it? There is no other choice.
Oh, you're biting your tongue. I've never seen you do this.
Oh, no, I'm just saying I'm not
exciting.
going to use the sword to do that. But okay.
Got it.
Let's move on. We got a lot of other
I
questions.
know, but man, that got nice and spicy. Yes, we're keeping it at like a somewhere between PG-13 and R. How's that? Who's next? Who has a question? I see. I'm coming to you next. If you want to say your name, you can. You don't have to.
Not Nathan.
Hi. Well, sorry. I won't pick on you, though, Ken. This question's for Calvin.
Hi.
So I agree with the ideal that you described of the government, the church, and the family units being subject to God's law. But the only way I can imagine that actually happening is for there to be a healthy, God-fearing body of Christ in the church that collectively calls out individuals and their wickedness and calls them to subject themselves as individuals to God's law. And so could you just, that's the only way I can imagine it happening. My question for you is, do you picture some other system or process through which any human institution that's composed of individuals would subject itself to God's law?
I believe very strongly, I think it was Thomas Jefferson who very early in our history said that the system we've created is suitable for the governance of a moral people and wholly insufficient to the governance of any other. And I think that we're seeing the cracks forming and widening pretty badly right now. I think that we're going to, at some point within the next, age of America, have to figure out what kind of government will be necessary for the kind of people we have, because the one we have right now just isn't doing the job. I don't know what that will look like. I hope that the years that are to come are peaceful and result in something better. That would be a rare occasion in history.
To bounce off of your Jefferson quote about a righteous and moral people, I would counter with a Lysander Spooner quote, one of the abolitionist anarchists that I mentioned earlier. Back in the Civil War, and I think this definitely applies today, in the Constitution of No Authority, it's a pamphlet, he says that the Constitution has either created the current crisis, which is civil war, or you could talk about America devolving right now. It has either created the current crisis, or it has been powerless to prevent it. In either scenario, it is unfit to exist.
All right, we're going to move on.
I agree.
All right. Okay. Oh, we're making friends. I love it. Okay, our next question. Here you go.
Why should we obey the law? And that's a question for both the Christian theonomist and the Christian anarchist. Most of the reasons I've heard so far have been utilitarian reasons, that it's going to make your life better, it's going to make all of our lives better. But aren't there some Christian moral reasons for obeying the law? There's a command from Jesus Christ to render unto Caesar. We read in Paul saying, obey a Caesar named Nero. Nero didn't make their lives better. Obeying the law a lot of times doesn't make our lives better in our current regime, I think. But from my Catholic perspective, I go to St. Thomas as well, and he has a question about patriotism. And, our friends that we have who are maybe not college educated, but very simple but proud Americans, they are patriotic and they have gratitude. Aquinas says it's all rooted in gratitude. It's not about it's going to make your life better. You have a debt to your country of gratitude, natural debt, and you have a debt to your parents, natural debt, and you have a supernatural debt to God, who also commanded you honor your father and mother, and that's connected to patriotism.
I absolutely agree. I think it was probably inevitable that we got here. So I think it's time to dive into Romans 13 then.
Romans 13,
Let's just dig deep. The ultimate reason why should we follow what government says? Because it is necessary, because it is good. And I think the ultimate reason to do anything is because God said so. So let's just dive in. Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who will do so bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do what is right, but for those who are wrong. Do you want to be free from fear from the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. Now, I will say, obviously not all governments do what is right. Lots of governments call good evil and evil good. That's not uncommon at all. But I think that God is pretty clear here and a couple of other passages where he said, the fundamental reason I have given you government is to punish the good. Whoa. That's not a Freudian slip. That's me thinking too far ahead.
Dude. That's my position.
The reason we have government is to punish the wicked and to protect the good. Now, if a government's not doing that, it has placed itself outside of God's will. But ultimately, why should we follow government? Because there is a reason, a necessary reason, a good reason why it exists. And God is very, very clear when he says, I need you to be following these unless they contradict me. My will, my law is always to be higher, but in any matter besides contradiction, work with your government because I've given it to you for a reason, because you need it, because it's good for you.
So I think you're, all of that hinges on the without contradiction. That's doing a lot of the heavy lifting there for us. But Romans 13, I'm so glad you mentioned the render unto Caesar, and you mentioned the Romans 13, because I think these are both very, very similar passages. Paul has got to be assuming the Romans are reading his mail, right? And Romans 13 does say everything that he just read. It says, submit to the authorities, right? Even as they throw you to lions. Like, the government does not wield the sword for nothing. It wields the sword only because the wicked need to be scared of it. And it's like, yo, we just saw our buddy get crucified, for nothing more than being a Christian. What are you talking about, Paul? And I think the answers come in Romans 12 and 14 that bookend Romans 13, right? And then I'll move on to the render unto Caesar. But like what Paul starts off with is saying that you have a duty to love each other. Then he does this weird little tangent about the government. And then at the very back end of that, he says, but the law that governs you, that law is love. The only law that governs you is love. And Jesus does something very similar when he talks about render unto Caesar. They bring him a denarii with Caesar's image on it. And they say, hey, the tax collectors like Matthew the disciple tell us that we need to pay our taxes, right? And the zealots like Judas, not the one who betrayed him, but the other Judas, the revolutionary Israelites say that we don't need to pay taxes, right? Like, hey, Jesus, can you square this circle? Like, they can't both be right. And Jesus does a clever bit of theological jujitsu. He takes the coin and he says, whose image is on the coin? And my answer is, okay, it's Caesar's image. And he's like, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, blank, and render unto to God what belongs to God. Now, the Romans will not understand this. Very much like the Romans reading Paul's mail, they're going to hear what they want to hear, and they're not going to hear the other part. What is Jesus saying? Render unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, blank, render unto God what belongs to God, right? This four-part syllogism. Romans aren't going to understand the blank, but what are the good little Jews and boys that grew up reading the Torah and the Talmud going to know? Whose image is on you, right? Caesar's image is on the coin. Give that to him. But these coins often say things like, Caesar, the son of God. Like, these are like heretical coins to an Israelite. But render unto God that which belongs to God. Caesar thinks he owns you. And Jesus is saying, no, he doesn't. which is a radical, revolutionary idea that, like, some would argue probably got him killed. But God is greater than Caesar. We have no king but Christ. I like that.
I like how every time that's your mic drop. No king but Christ. It's also the title that they came up with that. All right.
It was funny it sounded like you guys were against each other in the beginning, and then it sounded like almost that you agreed with each other almost implicitly about how things would move forward. It brought to mind some of James K. Smith's work and Charles Taylor's work about some of the challenges of the Reformation and all that's come since then, where we move all of our energies, Christian energies, into what he called the immanent frame, where we're thinking about what God wants us to do here and now as almost a primary topic. And I'd love to get both of your comments on sort of Peter, 2 Peter, if we're going for verses here, 1 Peter 2,
13.
Yeah, 2:11.
Have that in my notes.
Yeah, as sojourners here. Yeah, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on that day of visitation. And so it seems there to encourage us. I guess the question is, where is the command of Scripture to work so hard at solving the nation problem? And that's really the question. In light of our role as exiles here, where is that command to do that work in this frame to fix this frame? Does that make sense?
I think it does. I'd say a couple of things. One, it is important to remember that we are in hostile territory, so to speak. There is a king of this world who is against us, and his defeat is assured, and all of this will be wiped away, and something new will exist in the new heavens and earth. But I think that particularly American, particularly evangelical Christianity seems to have this weirdly Gnostic strain to it, where we become so escapist, singing, I'll fly away, that we forget and we take our hands off of any duty to make a more God-honoring society in this world. I think that that's a huge problem with this strain of dispensationalism that seems to have become so massively prevalent that we say, well, Jesus is going to come down and we'll have 1,000 good years, etc. So we don't really have much of a duty.
After 7 bad ones.
I think that more rightly understood, this earth, you might say this earth is a garden, right? I mean, we are here to tend to what God has given us, to create more flourishing and goodness, to glorify Him and to spread His word. And one of the spheres, not the only, but one of the more important perhaps spheres where that works itself out, is a Christian duty to behave as Christians and to honor and glorify God in government and the organization of society, because that has massive effects on the amounts of bloodshed and terror and evil that occur in this world. When Christians take our hands off and decide we're only going to focus on honoring God by wishing He would come and fix all of this, instead of proactively tending to the garden that is the world around us, the enemy gains ground, evil becomes stronger, and the world becomes a darker place.
I agree with everything he said on eschatology. Like, that is, I grew up reading the Left Behind books, and now I'm like, whoa, no, dude.
But we are friendly to pre-mill if you're here and you are of that persuasion.
Yeah, we'll have another debate like this, yeah. But I agree with everything you said about a Christian people doing Christian things. I just don't want it to be done by the sword. I want it to be done voluntarily. That's it.
I love the quick answer. Mark, did you have a follow-up? He is the host, so he gets to ask a follow-up.
Okay.
That's fair.
Now, the follow-up would be, Miroslav Volf talking about vengeance when he lived through decades and decades of ethnic cleansing back and forth, and had to say at some point you have to trust in God's final judgment and not take it into your own hands in order for that to work. The question really is, I understand that you can make a case for doing it. Where is the command to do it?
Can I take this?
Yeah, go right
think
ahead.
I think there's a command to not take up the sword when you're doing that. I think let's go to Tertullian, who, if you don't know who the...
That's not in the Bible, Ken.
I know.
Keep going. I'm just messing with you.
He's quoting the Bible.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
He is St. John taught this guy named Polycarp, and Polycarp taught this guy named Tertullian, who is awesome. He goes on to say, like, Christ disarmed every Christian when he disarmed Peter. Like, when you talk about, like, how does a Christian live under Rome, and I think we would both agree that America is more Rome than the kingdom of God, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So how does a Christian live under Rome? Tertullian has some answers. He says, like, even though it's legal and even honorable in the eyes of the law to make an occupation of the sword, is it actually lawful for a Christian to do that? Like, lawful in air quotes? Like, when the Lord proclaims that he who uses the sword shall perish by the sword, shall the Christian apply the chain and prison and torture and punishment? He is not even the avenger of his own wrongs. God is, right? That's right. Shall he keep guard before Roman temples, these temples that he has renounced, leaning and resting on the spear, this spear that pierced the side of Christ? Shall he carry a flag, a rival to Christ? Caesar's laurel, his victory crown, this crown of triumph, is it made with leaves or of corpses? Is it adorned with ribbons or with tombs? Is it dripping with the fragrance and ointments, or with the blood of the slain and the tears of their wives and mothers? This may even be the blood and the tears of some Christians, for Christ is also among the barbarians. There's a lot of church history and a lot of scripture that says, put the sword down, live under Rome, do not. Like, you can oppose it while submitting to it. Right?
And that's what you do, right, Ken?
Yeah, don't pick up the sword.
That's why I speak.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm just imagining someone in the podcast, like, starting halfway through and hear, like, blood dripping off. Okay, who has our next question? Noah? Oh, I shouldn't name you if you're going to ask something controversial.
Calvin.
Hi.
Do people have a right to religious freedom under a theonomous state? And if not, how should defectors be treated?
Simple question. You have 30 seconds.
Very interesting. Very interesting. There is a spectrum. When the founders of America created the First Amendment, they lived in a society such that freedom of religion, more or less to them, meant you can be, Anglican or Methodist or Baptist or whatever you like. I think that the thought of them too, Scottish Presbyterians, but the thought of people of fundamentally different worldviews and beliefs on what the nature of God and goodness are, sharing one organized society, hadn't really occurred to them, wasn't something they considered within the realm of possibility. 250 years later, it is, and I think it's causing issues. I think one of the reasons there is so much chaos and division in our society is because so many people fundamentally disagree on what man is, what we should do and not do, what his highest goals are, and what sharing a society together looks like. And under the current government we have, I don't think that it's working terribly well. I would see a significant reshaping of the conception of what religious freedom looks like, incorporated into the breakdown of America into significantly smaller societies, small enough that people can decide pretty much freely in which one and where they would like to live.
But the founders weren't like all in agreement on like what society should look like either, and they were certainly not like Christian and agreed with like Christian principles. Like Jefferson freaking cut the resurrection out of the Bible because he's like, that's unscientific, right? And Jefferson and Adams he called him a hermaphrodite, like a transgender hermaphrodite. Like they hated each other all the time. Aaron Burr and like Hamilton like got into a duel and shot each other over like minor squabbles. Everyone was sleeping around. Like these were not a moral and righteous people that said we need a government by moral and righteous people.
Agreed.
Okay, cool.
I'm not really sure where to go with that one. I don't disagree with you on that. I will say I think that the presence of a few deists in the original congregations doesn't negate the fact that the Bible is the most frequently referenced book in both the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. But I think that by and large, to sort of directly answer Noah's question, in my consideration, I would say religious freedom I do not consider to be the highest good. I think that the honoring of God is the highest good, and that when we take religious freedom to such a place that the enemy gains a foothold and spreads darkness in the world, then it is an idea that has been abused and should be rethought.
And when we break down into smaller societies that are governed on their own, Theology on Tap can be one. Who wants to be part of ours? Any takers? What? We'll allow Methodists, Baptists, Episcopalians, everybody. Okay. Who has another question for us? I see a hand over here. I feel like old school Phil Donahue here.
In your view, what is, if any, the difference between power and authority? And what are their relationships?
I would say authority is a moral right. Power is the ability to enforce it. Authority is something that you have by nature, by moral principles, that is rightly owed to you. That is what justice owes and demands. Power is whether you can back it up. And there are plenty of times that those who have just authority have not had power, and there are plenty of times that people have power who do not deserve authority. I would much rather those who deserve authority have power than those who do not.
I'm a bit of a postmodernist. I think it might be a distinction without a difference. But to answer, I think what is at the heart of the question is like who is kind of what you were getting at. Who deserves the power and who deserves the authority? I'm gonna go with Jesus on this one. When Pontius Pilate has Jesus presented before the Jews, that is like it's the king of the Jews. Like Jesus looks at him and he says, all the power that you think you have, this is an illusion. It's not your power at all. Like the power that you have, like that's only like on you because God allows it to happen. And that power is God's. Like any power that we have or authority that we have, that's an illusion, right? And it's not legitimate, in my opinion. The only legitimate power and legitimate authority comes from God. So.
Okay, Mark, you got your two. Don't get greedy. All right, I'm coming across the room here.
Greek is a weird language.
And I think I'm going to ask the question after this one. I'll use mine.
I'm going to, I guess, follow up on what was just said. It kind of sounds like, Ken, the way where you're coming from is that you need the entire world to think like you do in order for your society to exist. Because, I mean, if I don't agree with you, it sounds like I can walk into your house right now, take all your stuff and leave, and you're not going to do anything about it. So therefore, everyone's going to have to agree with you to live that way in order for that to exist. And so I guess, I don't know, that's what made me think about that when I started hearing about the power and authority. So it almost sounds like, in your world, I mean, there is no authority. There is no power.
I mean, Jesus did talk about somebody taking your coat and you giving him your shirt too, right?
Everyone, Ken's address is 444. No.
But I think the larger point you're trying to make is well, who are you going? Like, the Republicans like to say, like, next time call a crackhead, if you're against the police. But it's like, that's not what the police are there to do either. Like, when you need help in minutes, the police, when you need help right now, the police are 20 minutes away, right? That's not what the police are there to do. They're not to stop somebody from coming into your house and robbing your stuff. Like, that hardly ever happens. They're here and gone in armed robberies. But, like, eminent domain is a thing where they're the one taking the stuff. Again, like, and you're saying in my community might be closer to like an Amish community without a lot of material possessions, right? You could ask them what's going to happen when somebody, they're all nonviolent, right? And like, what's going to happen? I don't know. But I guarantee you a bunch of communities around them are going to be like, hey, that's not cool. Don't like.
Aren't they protected by the U.S. government? They only exist right now because the United States government allows them to exist.
No, I'd say they're protected by their neighbors, right? Like, Jesus didn't go around saying, like, everyone should give up their sword and only the Romans should be the one to have the sword. No. He said, you give up your sword, right? Like, I trust my neighbors. I don't own guns, right? But I'm not really Second Amendment. I'm more like Marx, who is like Second Amendment plus a lot more. Because, like, he says that, like, Marx is even more pro-gun than like Jefferson or but the idea that like I don't want my neighbors to have guns, I want the government to have guns, right? That's kind of crazy. I don't think that's what Jesus is about. Like, let the Romans go and take everyone's swords away. Like, no. To answer your question about like what happens when there's violence, like I trust my neighbors to defend me from violence a lot more than I trust the cops. In the Amish community, if somebody goes in and starts doing that, like, I guarantee you a lot of their neighbors are going to say, hey, that's not right. Their neighbors who may be more or less Christian might pick up guns and say, hey, that's not right, and we're going to defend them. I'm a little bit of and I don't really have much of an answer to the problem of violence, right? I know that, like, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the rabbi Jesus is being taken away to his death and Peter pulls out a sword, right? That's what my gut reaction would want to be, to defend like my closest friend from being arrested and like executed. And Jesus told him to put down the sword. It's probably really confusing for Peter and it's really confusing to me. I don't think that's my gut reaction. And I think the ideas of Jesus are very, very hard to attain, but
if I may,
what Jesus said. So go ahead, dude.
I think that anarchy has been quote unquote tried a few times in history. And I think the most relevant example in Western history is the fall of the Roman Empire. When the government collapses and nothing is left, we did not see Europe quickly turn into a lot of happy people going about doing whatever they wanted and everything being nice. When the government was gone, one of two things happen in any era of human history. Either people come together in local communities, they band together for mutual organization and protection. The neighbors get together, arm themselves, they build walls to keep the barbarians out, and I would call that a government. A small one, but a government. Or, if they did not do that, or failed to do so, were unsuccessful in that effort, they were conquered by barbarians, by bandit gangs, by raiders from across the river, by whoever could come in and say, guess what? Rome is gone. I've got more guys with bigger swords. You're going to do what I say. I'm going to burn your crops. I'm going to kill your children because they're a threat to mine. I'm going to have my way with your wife, and no one can stop me anymore. That's what we need governments for. We need government because there is no such thing as a vacuum of power. Vacuums of power have always been and always will be filled by force. I don't like that. I don't want that to happen. I do not want the barbarian to have his way. And if that looks like bringing people together for common and mutual defense, I believe that is a government. And if I see that my wife is being taken and my children put to the sword, I don't think that God would have me throw my hands up and say, I'm just going to let this continue because of Peter. When Christians let evil happen, it's a binary choice. We either side with God or with the enemy. We side with order or with anarchy. And anarchy is not a tenable state. Anarchy inevitably becomes tyranny, which takes centuries and centuries to turn back into anything livable.
Well, I don't think I would let my wife and family get raped and murdered either, right? I
Peace is like good
she's
to
right
hear.
in the audience, so. But you mentioned power vacuums, and like power vacuums only happen when the government gets that freaking big, right? You look at like Iraq and the destabilization that happened after Saddam Hussein's regime was like collapsing. The Roman Empire fell after it got so big because it was the incestuous relationship of the church and the state, like post-Constantine. Power vacuums get a lot bigger and a lot more violent when they come from a collapse of a big and violent state. Again, the objections to anarchy are usually just descriptions of the status quo, but we probably have a lot more questions.
We agree on the differences in whether or not government should be big or small. I think that we both believe that 99% of it, it's that last 1%, should anything exist at all, that I think remains a pretty big question.
I would be happy in your shire.
Oh, okay, next question.
Could you reconcile for me the statement that anarchy is untenable and that it has been tried numerous times before? Because you said both in the last answer, which is a logical contradiction.
Anarchy is not a system. Anarchy is the alleged absence of a system, and nature abhors a vacuum.
You said anarchy hasn't been tried, but like we're in an anarchistic relationship right now. Right, neither one of us holds authority over. I
have all the power.
Oh no, not Sarah. No, it's voluntary. I can leave if I want. Right, like we're not coercing anybody by like the point of a sword, which I keep coming back to. But like, we're all in an anarchistic relationship with each other right now, and we're not. Like,
we're
killing
not.
Each other.
None of us are allowed to kill each other.
Okay, who else has a question? Well, and I haven't asked mine yet, but Kit kind of got to it, so I may or may not. We'll see.
Speaking of the sword, so my question, it goes to that for Calvin. A government wielding the sword of justice against the wicked, right? I think that's what we said. So who is the wicked? And how can we, from my perspective, how can we be so confident and, dare I say, vain to believe that we or anyone else can represent the voice of God in determining the wicked, right? So that's for you. And if I can just to summarize, help me if I'm doing a decent job summarizing what I'm taking from you, is that in a lack of an ability to guarantee that any one person can truly represent the voice of God, it's better to have no government at all than a flawed or overpowered one.
You're so smart.
That's why you're married.
They are married. Okay.
I will say,
isn't she lovely?
we know what is good and what is wicked, because God tells us, because he reveals his nature in the world, in logical, knowable, rational principles, and most primarily and most explicitly in his word. We know who has committed wickedness through extensive due process and presentation of evidence. It's worth remembering that in the Old Testament law and the rules that the Jews were to follow leading up to the time of Christ, I would argue that they had significantly more due process, a much higher burden of proof to say that someone is guilty of a crime than we do. So I'll certainly say that if we're going to be, convicting people and saying that they've done wicked, terrible things and punishing them for it, we ought to be darn sure. We shouldn't be doing this willy-nilly, But God has revealed to us what is good and what is bad in multiple ways, and it is better that people be stopped from doing what is bad to each other.
Specifically, the good and bad ways on how you buy and sell female slaves that are from the captors that you would just... Sorry. This isn't about just war, but... Sorry. I mean, it's in there. Like, the God tells you how and, like, how long to not touch your female slave from the enemy that you conquered, like, before you can, have rated R relations with them.
Well, like I said, I don't believe that we need to map over the Old Testament law one for one.
Neither do
We're
I.
a different people, a different society under a different covenant than they were, but we can still look for norms. God has still revealed to us what he considers to be good, what he considers to be bad, what he considers to be theoretically acceptable under some circumstances. And he's given us the logical and moral capacity as a creature made in his image to understand him at least enough to convict us, which is enough for our purposes.
I think, yes, totally. But we are divided on those things. That's why we're here today, right? And so for that, you're a criminal defense attorney, right? Who is the criminal defense attorney for these people in this government, right? Who is defending the wicked that is being determined by God that we can't, again, how are we confident that we are going to determine that when we are so divided?
Well, I always think in my field, it's not the job of a criminal defense attorney to defend the wicked. It is the job of a defense attorney to defend the accused. Just as Christ is our advocate before the Father, just as we believe in and follow a God who became man and was wrongfully convicted despite having done no evil, it's our job to safeguard and watch a system whereby the evil are punished and the good are protected. But before we punish anybody, like I said, we need to make darn sure, and there needs to be in any society a rigorous and well-protected process before punishment is administered. Otherwise, a government will very quickly turn into one that calls evil good and good evil and places itself outside of God's will and his honor.
I will say, as you guys are talking, there are a lot of subjects coming up that we could go into and we're not going to, like the death penalty or all of the talk about
worth.
slaves in the Old Testament. If you have things like that you want to hear either a mini TOT about or a podcast episode, tell us, because we would love to do more of those. So, but I'm going to turn it over to, well, maybe I won't say your name, just in case you want to be anonymous.
I'm anonymous.
What's up, man?
Standing up.
Okay,
I love how she says we want to keep
spicy.
everyone anonymous, but she had everyone introduce themselves at the start.
Oh, man.
Okay, during 2020, everything was crazy. And in Portland, it was super crazy. And there was a thing that happened called Chaz. So what do we call that? Is that anarchy? Was that a vacuum of power? Yeah.
Yeah, Chaz was like, what, the Capitol Hill?
Chop
was it?
Oh,
like
yeah.
Capitol, yeah, the Capitol
I remember
Hill
that.
occupied protest. Like,
It was an autonomous zone, right? There were no
Autonomous
rules.
zone was when it was later named Chaz. Like, I don't know. I don't think a bunch of dorks in Portland wearing balaclavas throwing a brick through an immigrant's bodega, like these white suburban dorks, I don't think they're anarchists, right? And, like, they had to take other people's property to do that, right? Like, and anarchy had a lot of different traditions, but my tradition is one where you don't take people's property. So no, I don't think that's anarchy. I don't think it's very nice either.
It also doesn't work very well. They tried growing vegetables on
Very
cardboard,
gross.
So.
I'd call it unsanitary. That's what I'd call it.
Could you imagine if a right wing, like Chaz, tried to make that? They would get Waco to Ruby Ridge in a heartbeat. Like, the fact that they let them go on that long was wild.
Did you have anything you want to say, Calvin, or hand it over to the next person?
No, just that's something I would like to see not happen very much. It didn't seem like a nice place to be.
No.
So would the women that were assaulted when they went there. That's right. Anybody else have a question? Everybody gets one. Some of you haven't asked. Is there... Yeah? Oh, look at that. Okay. I need to think of something to say when I'm on my way to this far part of the room.
All right. What do you feel about the phrase, the only black flag I like is the one with skull and crossbones on it?
Which is genuinely what I thought you were saying all those times, the pirates.
I mean, you heard my stuff about like intellectual property, right? Like, I think the best communities are like Wikipedia or like open source software, because like the only type of piracy that we have now is like, you know, in the digital realm.
Torrenting.
Is in the digital realm, but like the best communities that build new and innovative ideas the quickest are not when they're granted government not when the government offers them a monopoly just because they thought of something first, right? It's when people are allowed to read your code and piggyback off of it. Or like GitHub. Have you guys do you guys know any programmers? GitHub is an anarchic sea of wonderfulness. It's amazing. If you guys know any programmers, ask them about GitHub. It's amazing.
So I'll say two things about skull and crossbones, two very different spheres. I would say one, the Caribbean of the 1600s doesn't sound like it was a super nice place to live. If I was, a merchant taking my sugarcane to Nassau or something, I would be a lot more happy to see a Royal Navy flag on the horizon than knowing that a skull and crossbones flag was on its way to kill me and take all of my stuff. And if I saw a skull and crossbones flag coming to kill me and take all of my stuff, I'd be really glad to see the flag of the Union Jack coming to stop them from killing me and taking my stuff.
You're a little bit wrong. You don't want to see the black flag. Black flag just means they're coming to take your stuff. Red flag is no quarter. And that means they're coming for blood. You don't want to see the red flag.
I don't remember that part of Assassin's
Sounds
Creed,
like my dating
and that's
life.
where most of my history comes from. I'll also say, as a brief aside, if we want to talk about intellectual property and modern piracy, I think that we should probably rethink the way that we do intellectual property and patents and all of that stuff. But I think that there's a strong case to be made that if I come up with an idea, if I research some scientific process and invent some kind of new formula or device or something like that, I would really like to know that someone can't just come, take that idea from me, and then use all of my hard work and my effort and my education and make a whole bunch of money without me. I see intellectual property as being real property, which should be protected, and you shouldn't be allowed to steal other people's ideas because you have to work to have an idea.
So this is a argument about trade-offs, right? Everything has a pro and a con. You have to compare A to B, right? Do you have intellectual property or not? What are the trade-offs, right? The Economist, when asked, is your wife beautiful, says, compared to what?
Oh my God.
Right? So from an economics perspective, the trade-offs that we're looking at when we talk about intellectual property are, like you said, first mover protection. If you invent something first, are you protected, right? And the trade-off that I'm offering is community-oriented innovation, where you get to piggyback off of somebody's idea instead of only that person being able to innovate on an initial idea that they had. It's trade-offs. And I'm just arguing that the lack of intellectual property, government-granted monopoly, is going to be better than the protections for the first mover that you mentioned. So it is a trade-offs question.
I would slide us one way down the scale for sure, probably closer to where you are than where we are right now. But at the end of the day, I think that people's work and ideas should be protected, and you shouldn't be allowed to steal the work and the idea that somebody had and make a bunch of money off of it, and they have no recourse. That seems unjust.
All right, we're going to go to our next question.
Well, I'm sort of part of a circle that more or less analyzes the legacy of Ted Kaczynski, which I imagine is a huge, big old can of worms. We're gonna ignore the bombings for a moment and just sort of focus on his general premise. His general premise that mankind as a community is healthier and happier the further removed we are from a controlling industrial society, closer to the source of our sustenance and to each other. So kind of segueing in from the intellectual property, which is entirely based in technology these days, how does technology come into play with anarchism and government and for Calvin, for righteous government?
So I said the black flag comes in many colors. One of those is a black and green. They're known as the anarcho-primitivists. They're like Ted Kaczynski. But there's also the opposite end of that, like technology spectrum, which is anarcho-transhumanists, which we actually had a debate on transhumanism, which is that like all of these government regulations are probably 10 to 20 years behind, behind the curve, and that new technology innovations largely make what the government tries to regulate obsolete. You guys remember when we had those weird spirally looking light bulbs? Right, we moved from we moved from like incandescent light bulbs, these weird little spirally like gas halogen fluorescent ones, and then after that we moved to LEDs. But like the government was mandating everyone have these little spirally ones, and then like LEDs came and made that completely irrelevant, right? That would be a little bit of the anarcho-transhumanism like thing. Is it's like we're going to invent better stuff, and as much as the government tries, there's a real interesting debate on guns about this with ghost guns and 3D printing. Cody Wilson is a crazy dude.
Industrial society and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. I believe, like I said, I would like a society that looks something like the Shire. I think all you have to do is drive through Baytown to realize where we live is a lot closer to Mordor. I think that we live in a society that has prioritized money and capital over the good of humanity and the good of the world that God has given us to take care of. I think that it is a strong Christian principle that we are to look after, tend, and enable as much flourishing of God's good green earth as possible, and that we are dishonoring him in some very real way by paving things down, by filling his good sky with smog, by polluting the water, by making the planet Earth more and more unlivable for happy, healthy humans. I would see a God-honoring government that instituted some pretty strong environmental regulations in order to stop the degradation of God's world in the name of more and more capital at all costs. That being said, I also think that innovation has been one of the greatest ways in history that societies move beyond the worst of some of the environment's destruction. I think it's good that we move past the Victorian age and, London smog and, little boys working in factories and being covered in dust, right? So there is a balance to be found there. I believe that a government that honors God needs to find a balance between innovation, entrepreneurialism, human wealth and flourishing, and the destruction of what God's given us in the pursuit of capital at all costs. There is a balance to be found there, but we are far, far away from anything that I think he would consider honoring to his commands right now.
And just want to put this out there. We love our brothers and sisters in Baytown. We don't think they're making orcs or any of that kind of stuff. You're always welcome at our events. We have time for one, maybe two more questions before we close out. Does anybody else have a question? Someone that hasn't asked yet? Okay, I see a couple people champing at the bit. Turns out that's the right way to say it. To ask a second one. Does anybody want to ask a second question? You're dying to, maybe? Okay, we're going to see if we can squeeze in one, maybe two, and then don't go anywhere. We're taking a picture.
You talked a lot about the sword as force, and even talked about how the Amish allow people to go out and come back and all of that. It seems like you underestimate the social force of community in that world. It's like that the sword is only one kind of force, but community force exercises vast. And I just wondered, in the anarchist system, how do you account for what you call voluntary? How do you account for what is sort of really overwhelming social pressure in those smaller communities versus the sword? How does anarchy deal with social pressure?
I'm not arguing against it. I'm actually kind of saying I'm for it. I'm saying that is the only way to build a more kingdom of God, Christ-like community. The only way is with our brothers and sisters. It's not ever going to be top down from the state. Sure.
And that social force, parents to children would be a top-down social force that exists inherently in those systems.
As far as parents are concerned, I'm a little bit in favor of like peaceful parenting. Granted, I don't have kids, so like.
Oh yeah, hey, trust me. I mean, you've seen these guys over here. I mean, you can't do it that way. Okay.
You hit your sister, therefore I'm going to hit you and give you a spanking. Like to tell you that hitting people is bad. Like I think that's kind of crazy. I think that. Like, you reason with kids at the level that they're at and give them more and more freedom as they grow into it, right? In a community structure, and I'd be fine with community structures. Like, yeah.
We'll have Ken back after he's had a couple kids and see what he says about that.
I say that right now without kids, so we'll see.
So I'd say two things. One, like I said, I think theonomy, as I mean it, means that government is submitted to God, the church is submitted to God, and the family is submitted to God. And the Amish are a great example of a community that is little more than an extension of the family. Agreed. It is more than that, but their community is much closer to family than, trying to figure out what I have in common with somebody from New York City or LA, right? I think that a family that is rightly submitted to God, a community submitted to God, takes a lot of the pressure off of government having to pick up the slack. And that if we had and have strong families and communities that honor God, we would find a lot of the issues of law and chaos in society that government has to handle through force become much, much easier to deal with. But I think that those issues will never be solved so long as people fundamentally disagree on the nature of what people are. I think that children, as sweet and cute as they are, and as much as we all love them, are great examples of the sinful nature. No one has to teach kids how to hit each other and steal each other's toys. You have to teach them and you have to train them otherwise. And the more that parents fail to do so, the more that there is a necessity for government to do the job that they failed to do. So I will certainly say that is the primary duty, should be the primary actor. But let's face it, there's a lot of kids out there, and there always will be a lot of kids out there who weren't brought up the right way, who don't honor God, and who continue to hurt people and take their stuff. And there always will be. And as long as there are those, you will need some kind of a force to stop them, to punish the wicked and protect the good. That force is and should be a government that honors God.
Any last words, Ken? I'm going to wrap us up.
Well, I would answer that. The first part of that, with that the community is the answer to it, not the politicians, right? The community is the only answer to the little kids that put the T in the Calvinist tulip, right? The total depravity. Community has to be the answer, because the politicians... they don't care about your kids. They don't even send their own kids to public school, right? They're going to ask you to fund the schools, and then they'll segregate and isolate their own kids in their rich little communities. Politicians are never going to be the answer to community problems, and yet they keep trying to be the answers to it. In an ideal world, let's go all the way back to the founders to answer the second part of your point, which is, I think it was Benjamin Franklin that said, if angels governed men, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. And if angels governed men, we wouldn't need this system of checks and balances. We wouldn't need to limit the government at all, right? But like a chia pet, it just keeps growing and growing and growing, no matter how much you try to limit it.
Do you believe men to be angels?
No. But it sounds like you believe these men at the top of theophany to be the angels governing men that he also warned about. And I'm saying, limit their power. Don't limit it, remove it.
Let's finish out the quote.
Okay.
If men were angels, we would not need government.
Sure.
If angels govern men, we would not need constraints on government.
Right.
However, men govern men, therefore we need a government which has controls. Unless you believe men to be angels, then we will always need something to punish the wicked and protect the good.
Constraints, not controls. And my point this entire time has been that the violence done by the state is always greater than the violence done by individuals. Power vacuums that we mentioned earlier left by the state are going to be much, 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 much bigger and have much more radioactive fallout than the small power vacuums in a local and small community. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to try to wrap us up. So you can each maybe have one more sentence, and then we're going to... Or not.
You want to go?
You finish what you were saying.
Oh, yeah, no. I was just saying, like, the power vacuums and the violence done by the state is like going to, like, these are problems that are descriptions of the status quo, right? You say, oh, what would anarchy look like? I would say, what does it look like now, right? With the violence that exists now and the power vacuums that are caused by the state, like, not the state's absence, right? We go and topple a regime. Okay, so this would be my closing thoughts, right? Because I love railing against the government, but here's what the military-industrial complex that we were all warned about, like, here's what they do, right? You got the Joint Chiefs of Staff and generals, they come up to the president and they say, hey, we got this dictator and he's a real bad guy. This is a comedy bit that comes from David Smith, a hilarious comedian. We got this dictator and he's a real bad guy. So what we're going to do is we got a small rebel group that we found that is opposing the dictator. We're going to send them weapons. We're going to send them arms. We're going to fund this small rebel group and overthrow that dictator. 7 years later, they come to the next administration and say, hey, it worked great. We overthrew the dictator. One tiny little problem. This small rebel group has turned out to be a major freaking problem, and they're even more violent and even more dangerous than the dictator was, but we got a solution. Mm-hmm. We found a small rebel group in the region, and we're going to send them weapons and fund them. And on the cycle continues. And yeah, the government doesn't wield the sword for good. It just doesn't.
One sentence.
I will say by way of conclusion, our first and highest duty is always to honor and glorify God in our own lives and to those around us. And we should never lose track of that command. But so long as we live in a fallen world where men fall into sin and passion and do evil to one another, we have a binary choice. Order, which keeps men from committing those evil acts and punishing them when they do, or chaos, where every man does what is right in his own eyes and evil is allowed to flourish and to rule. I would advocate a government which honors God.
Okay, so thank you guys for coming to this. A round of applause for sure. And for those listening to the podcast, just a couple quick reminders and we'll close this out. One is that on August 15th, Dr. James Tour is coming to speak, and we're going to be exploring the idea of science and faith. Can they coexist? Sign up for that. September 12th is our next big fundraiser. Trivia, raffle, beer tasting, home brewers. If you're interested in competing, contact us. Everything you need to know about Houston Theology on Tap, you can find at HoustonTOT.com. And if you like what we're doing and you want to support us, and this is not just for the people listening to the podcast, this is for you guys too. You can go to HoustonTOT.com/give or talk to any of us here tonight and we will tell you how you can support us. But thank you for joining us. And until we see you next time, we encourage you as always to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.